Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support is greatly appreciated. Kindly like and share this audiobook to extend its reach, enabling more individuals to access its profound wisdom. Remember to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can propagate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, nurturing a community focused on enlightenment and inner serenity. We thank you for being a part of our mission to make these transformative teachings accessible to all. Let's commence today's reading. To keep you going. June 16, 2012. The Buddha's teachings don't start with a RST principle. They start with a last principle. The Buddha's own experience of total freedom from suffering. Everything else works back from that. On the one hand, he reacted on what he had to do in order to get there. But he also had to react on how to make his teachings persuasive to people where they were. How could he get other people to attain the same total freedom? And one of his strategies was to work with a desire that we have, maybe not all of us, but most of us, which is the desire for pleasure and happiness. Something that sometimes gets dismissed simply as being hedonistic, lazy, and of not much spiritual value. But he discovered that if you could take that desire and really take it seriously, it could lead you far. So, do you really want to be happy? What's involved in really being happy? For one, you'd like a happiness that's reliable, a happiness that doesn't turn on you. What does that happiness require? 1. It has to be founded on something that's not going to turn on you. And 2. The search for that happiness can't harm others, because if your happiness depends on their being harmed, they're not going to stand for it. 3. You have to trust in your own ability to do this. In other words, you have to believe in action, that your actions are real, that they really do have results, and that they're not totally determined. You can change your ways of acting. Otherwise, if they were totally determined from the past, you'd have no choices. And that would make you give up right there. So that's the beginning of wisdom. Compassion, of course, comes from the realization that your happiness can't depend on the suffering of others. And then there's the quality of purity, in which you really do make sure that your actions don't cause any suffering or any harm. You have to react on your actions and their results, again and again and again. Learning to recognize your mistakes and figuring out how not to repeat them. This requires a lot of work, but it does develop good qualities of mind. Wisdom, compassion, purity. These are honorable things. This is a pursuit of happiness that isn't just hedonistic. As you follow it, you're developing noble qualities of mind. And of course, another quality that you need to develop is patience, because if your idea of happiness is the quickest pleasure possible, you're never going to get anywhere. You have to be able to work for long-term goals and develop the endurance that will see you through. This point is emphasized in the Buddha's RST summary of his teachings, after he had converted the followers of the Kassapa brothers, Sariputta, Moggallana, and all of their fellow students who came from another teacher. After they had become arahants, the Buddha gave a sermon called the Avadapadamaka. We don't have a record of the full sermon. All we have is a record of the verses that the Buddha used to summarize the main points, but the verses are enough to let us know that he started his sermon with the theme of patient endurance. The message is that to grow in the practice you have to learn how to be patient. You have to learn how to endure. You have to learn how to stick with things, because this is a path that's going to take time. You can't let yourself get diverted by every little pleasure that comes past. In fact, you can't let yourself get diverted by major pleasures coming past that are going to pull you over the path. That requires a pragmatic kind of wisdom. How do you motivate yourself to stick with it? Especially when the results aren't coming immediately. How do you take pleasure in the fact that you're sticking with a path like this? There are various ways that the Buddha uses to motivate people. Primary is the sense of craft. He often compares all the different skills needed on the path to the skills of archers and cooks, carpenters, musicians. People who learn to take pride in their craft and enjoy doing it well. This means that we're concerned not only with the happiness that comes from having completed the work, but also with learning how to enjoy the work while you're doing it. So think of the meditation that you're doing right now as a kind of craft. That means developing a certain sort of resilience. Not sitting and simply wishing, may it work, may it work. Whatever you're doing, but telling yourself, I'm going to try this, to see if it does work. And if it doesn't work, I've learned, and I'll try another approach. Then be emotionally steady enough that you're prepared for things not to work or to work sometimes and not at other times. One of the biggest mistakes you can make as a meditator is to ND something that works for a little while, but then doesn't seem to work anymore, and so you just throw it away as totally useless. Actually, what you found was something useful in certain circumstances, and you want to remember it in case those circumstances come up again. There's a concept that comes with craftsmanship, which may sound strange to us in our modern romantic attitudes towards craft. It's called the dignity of obedience. There are skills that you have to pick up from other people. You can't insist immediately, I want to do things my way, or I want to explore things my way. First, you have to learn the basic skills needed to really do a good exploration, so that you also learn how to be a good judge of what's good craftsmanship and what's not. To do this, you have to be willing to follow the example of the expert craftsperson and imitate it as faithfully as possible. That's how you pick up these basic skills. That's the dignity of obedience. In the old days of the medieval guilds, there was a certain pride in learning how to do things, just as the master had done, not necessarily that you do it that way forever, simply that if you learn how to pick up those skills, then you're in a solid position to expand on them. But if you grope around without having developed those skills, how can you trust your own powers of judgment? At the same time, you're missing a good opportunity. So there's a certain dignity and pride that comes in listening to the Buddha's teachings and really giving them a fair chance. Learning how to adapt your ways of thinking and acting and speaking so that they tee in with the standards of the Buddha, instead of insisting that you want to change the Dhamma to suit your own ways. Now, there are ways that the Dhamma can be expanded. The great Ajahns, for instance, don't just quote texts at you. They have their own idiosyncratic ways of explaining the Dhamma, but it comes from their having mastered the basic skills. That's what gives it authenticity. So that's one of the ways you can motivate yourself. Learning how to take pride in your craftsmanship. The obverse of that, of course, is developing a sense of shame, a healthy sense of shame. When you think about doing things that you know are below the level of the craft, you should feel a sense of shame about it, that you'd be ashamed to do that. This doesn't mean you say, I'm a horrible person, I'm a miserable slob, but simply that you're above that kind of behavior. That's actually a sign of genuine, well-based self-esteem. One of the most destructive attitudes around nowadays is the idea that shame is bad for people, so we should try to make sure they don't feel any sense of shame. Like the drug counselor I met up in Vancouver. He was part of a service offering free counseling to the drug addicts among the many homeless people there. He was doing his best to get the addicts to come in and see him. And he found the only way he could do that was to try to make the addicts feel good about themselves. But after several years of this, he was telling me, this is not getting them out of the drugs. In fact, it's encouraging them to stay with the addiction, thinking that being a drug addict was perfectly nah. Sometimes a sense of shame is needed to make you a better person. Together with a sense of shame is a sense of compunction. When you see a course of action that you know is going to harm somebody, yourself or others, you want to develop a twinge of conscience. Wouldn't you really feel bad about doing that? That's your moral sense speaking to you. So shame and compunction are two other ways that you can motivate yourself and come to take joy in the fact that I'm acting in a way that's not harming anybody. I'm acting in a way that's honorable. There's a pleasure in that. There's a satisfaction in that. That even if you haven't reached the end of the path, at least you're behaving in an honorable way. And this is a path that harms no one. It develops good qualities of mind, such as the sense of honor that goes with the craft, and keeps shame from becoming debilitating. The major motivator, though, is heedfulness, realizing that if I don't work on my mind, if I don't develop these good qualities, there's going to be soaring down the line, big time. You can ask yourself, do you really love yourself? Yes. Do you want to soar? No. Make the voices that ask those questions and give the right answers the dominant factions of your mind, so that you don't kill your sense of shame. You don't kill your sense of compunction. You don't kill your sense of heedfulness. You take them seriously. The sense of heedfulness is the opposite of apathy, which says, I don't really care, which is the way that some people think that having no preferences is. Well, it doesn't matter. I'm okay with whatever comes up. Heedfulness says, no. If I've got it within my power, then this is the most important thing I have to accept. That I can make a difference. Are you going to abandon that ability? Are you going to pretend that you don't have it? If you do, what are you going to think when you soar down the line? You'll look back on the choices you could have made but didn't make because you were too lazy or too whatever to stick with them. That thought will bring a lot of regret or denial, neither of which is anything you want to develop. So these are some of the ways in which the Buddha has you motivate yourself to develop patience, so that you actually do end a sense of joy, a sense of well-being, even at the points where the path seems pretty hopeless, where you seem pretty hopeless. You're not getting the results you want, the dilemmas are yapping at your heels, whispering in your ears, saying, hey, come on. Give up. You want to have other voices in your mind that say, no, look. You really do want to take pride in your craftsmanship even though you haven't niched the table. You know you're working on a good table. Instead of thinking how many more steps it's going to take before the table is done, take each step, one at a time, and do it as skillfully as you can. Take joy in the skill, realizing that this is how you can keep your own best interests in mind. You're alert to the dangers out there. You're alert to the dangers in your own mind. We've all got dangerous minds. But you realize that you're on the path that takes you beyond them. Whether the results come quickly or slowly is not the issue. The issue is whether you stay on the path and you nurture all the voices in the mind that give you the energy to stay on the path. This is how you're a true friend to yourself, in that you can ultimately taste the Buddha's last principle, which is what gives the Dhamma all of its worth. When the Buddha talked about the essence of the heartwood of the teachings, it's the fact that release is true. And it's absolute. There's something of substantial and essential worth to it. Everything else the Buddha taught derives its worth from that fact. If you're going to reach that essence, though, you have to make yourself a worthwhile and substantial person. And you want to develop the wisdom not only to see that what the Buddha is talking about is a good thing, but also to know how to talk yourself into actually sticking with the good path that will take you there. The Science of Meditation. June 14, 2012. When you meditate, whether you realize it or not, you're actually making some assumptions. That the mind can be trained, that your actions can actually make a difference, and that it's worthwhile to train the mind, because the mind is what determines what actions you're going to take. You're also assuming that there's a pattern to the way action plays itself out. Certain actions are going to be skillful. In other words, they lead to good results. Other actions are not. They're going to lead to soaring, to harm. If there were no pattern, the things you learn today wouldn't be applicable tomorrow. You'd never know. Meditation, trying to learn any skill, would be a waste of time, because the rules could change at a moment's notice. And if your actions didn't make a difference, why are you sitting here? The simple fact that you're here meditating, trying to train the mind, means that, at least on one level, you accept these ideas as assumptions. It's like scientists. Sometimes people believe science doesn't make assumptions, that it doesn't accept anything that hasn't been proven. But that's not really the case. Scientists work with lots of assumptions. 1. If you're going to run an experiment, you have to assume that some things cause other things, and that by changing A, you may change B. In other words, you assume that there are actual causal connections in the world. In fact, that's what you're looking for. To see precisely what those connections are. You also assume that the way you design and run the experiment will make the difference between whether it's a good experiment or a bad one. You're assuming that people, you and other scientists, are responsible for their actions and they can make choices as they design and run their experiments. Some forms of CNTC knowledge like to claim that everything in the universe is predetermined by past causes, but the activity of science itself assumes free will. If people couldn't make choices, there'd be no sense in criticizing someone whose experiment was poorly designed or accepting the results of someone whose experiment was well designed. It would all be very arbitrary. And both sides could simply say, well, I was predetermined to do it that way. That would let them off the hook. You're also assuming that some patterns are universal. I was reading recently about experiments indicating that some of the constants they use in order to calculate the size and the history of the universe seem to be different in one direction from what they are in another. That's kind of scary. Scientists like to think that the laws of physics are the same everywhere. That's one of their basic assumptions. But this experiment calls that into question. So there are a lot of assumptions you make simply by the fact that you act. Try to be aware of these assumptions because we're going to be exploring them in the meditation. Meditation actually puts them to the test for a particular purpose, which is to put an end to sewering. You need to train the mind, you need to experiment. Now, experimenting doesn't mean simply following some rules. It means having a control and changing other things, manipulating them, and seeing if your manipulation makes a difference as measured against the control. You could sit and watch a process for years and years and years, but if you didn't do anything to the process, you wouldn't really know what the causal patterns are. You might think you see some patterns, but you can't really check them unless you've manipulated the causes and seen if the manipulation makes any difference in the effects. There's an old Thai joke about the farmer who went into a town for the first time in his life. He saw a flashing neon sign. It so happened that he saw the sign when the light was on. He walked up to it and tried to blow it out. He blew on it and sure enough the light happened to go out. So he assumed that he had blown it out. Of course, the way you check for that is to see if the sign comes back on again, and then see if it goes out on its own without your blowing on it, or if it goes out every time you blow on it. You've got to check things again and again and again, trying different approaches. This is particularly important as you try to get the mind to settle down. What's going to work? What's not going to work? Sometimes it's a yoke. You're sitting here and all of a sudden everything just comes together. But you've got to figure out why. Otherwise, it's not going to come together. Again, and you won't know what to do. It's not just a matter of accepting that, well, sometimes the mind comes together and sometimes it doesn't. The coming together, as the Buddha said, is something you want to develop. You work on it. You bring it into being. That's what bhavana, the Pali word for meditation, means. You bring things into being, you develop them. You work on your concentration. You see what you can do to make those moments of concentration more frequent and longer lasting. You've got to experiment. Otherwise you won't learn anything about the processes of the mind. You can see things arise and pass away, and that's it. But the important thing about arising and passing away is trying to notice what you did to make these things arise, particularly unskillful mental states. What did you do? And what did you do when they passed away? When there's zewering, stress. What did you do to increase the stress? What did you do when the stress stopped? Then, once you think you've noticed a connection, you've got to test it again and again. Ajahn Fuang wasn't interested in hearing about things happening in your meditation until they had happened at least 2 times. In other words, he wanted you to gain a certain amount of mastery over your meditation so that you could bring these states of mind into being at will. If they were just yukes, he wasn't interested. So it's important to be clear on our assumptions as we meditate here. The idea that we're simply going to watch things and that objective truth is going to appear when we're very non-interfering. You've got to call that idea into question because the truth may be appearing, but how are you going to know what's connected with what? After all, causation is the basic issue of right view. Right view is not about inconstancy, stress, not self. Those are the three characteristics or the three perceptions for developing dispassion. Right view has a larger framework. It's all about the Four Noble Truths. You're looking for the stress, trying to comprehend it until you can understand the cause. When you see the cause, you abandon it. The causal connection is what's important there. Similarly with the path. The path doesn't cause the end of sewering, but it takes you there. The image of the path is like a road going to a mountain. The road doesn't cause the mountain, and the fact that you follow the road doesn't cause the mountain, but by following the road you get there. There's a connection between the action and the point where it leads. We're assuming that there's a pattern here, otherwise what the Buddha taught 2,600 years ago wouldn't be relevant anymore. Things could change at any time. But if there's going to be a path to the end of sewering that people can't teach to one another, we have to assume that there's a pattern. Then, based on that assumption, we experiment. This is what's the NDC about meditation. We have some of the same assumptions that a scientist brings to an experiment. That you have free will, the ability to choose how you're going to design your experiment, and that you have to change things in order to learn about patterns. Otherwise, you can go through life thinking that neon signs are going to stay lit until you blow on them, just because one neon sign happened to go out the one time you blew on it. You have to try again and again and again to see what works and what doesn't, what's connected to what. That's where insight arises. And the skill in the meditation comes from learning how to anticipate when something is happening that will be skillful or not. If it's not, what are you going to do to detect it? If it is skillful, what are you going to do to make sure it really does give its results, and that it keeps on giving its results? The only way you can anticipate these kinds of things is by going over them again and again and again. So we try to limit the number of variables here. You're sitting here with your eyes closed, focused on the breath. Well, the mind's going to do a lot of different things even while you're focused just on the breath. You have the choice to decide what to do. You can change the way you breathe, you can change the way you focus. Which aspect of the process are you going to focus on? The Buddha talks about 4 frames of reference in establishing mindfulness. Body, feelings, mind, mental qualities, all taken in and of themselves. It's not that they involve doing 4 different kinds of meditation exercises. You stay with the breath, which is an aspect of the body. Then if you're having trouble staying with the breath, you look at what other issues might be involved. Is there something wrong with the feeling that you're creating with the breath? Can you change that feeling? The Buddha recommends breathing in a way that gives rise to rapture or pleasure. Do you know how to do that? That's one aspect of staying with the breath, but it's connected with feelings, too. Or you may look at the mind state that you're bringing to the meditation. Sometimes the mind is sluggish. Sometimes it's down, depressed, and you need to do something to give it more energy to gladden it, as the Buddha says. Other times, the mind is bouncing all around like a ping-pong ball. When that's the case, what can you do to get it to settle down? If it's burdened by a particular assumption, if it's burdened by a particular thought, what can you do to get it out from under the burden? That's using the mind as your frame of reference. You're still there with the breath, but you're looking at the problem from a different angle. The angle of how the breath is related to the mind. Finally, there are dhammas, mental qualities. This frame of reference gives guidance for when you see that something keeps pulling you away. How can you deal with it effectively so that you don't keep on being distracted by it? What qualities do you need to let go? What qualities do you need to develop? All of these 4 different frames of reference deal with different aspects of the problem of how you stay with the breath. The skill here is a matter of learning to read the situation to notice which aspect you have to focus on. This comes with practice, and it comes with experimenting, tweaking things. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut who compared scientists to little kids, people who still like to play even as they grow up. And most of the famous scientists were like that. They would play with ideas. They would play with possibilities. That's how they discovered things that other people hadn't discovered before, or hadn't even thought of before. Science is not a body of knowledge. It's an approach, with assumptions. And meditation is the same. You could read all the teachings in the canon, you could read all the teachings of the Ajahns, and be able to repeat them, but that wouldn't get you awakened. That's the wrong approach. What does lead to awakening is taking the Buddha's approach, which was an experimental approach, based on the assumption that you can learn from changing your actions. That's actually two assumptions. 1. You can change your actions. 2. There are patterns that can be learned in that way. This is what makes meditation a science. The clearer you are about the fact that the approach, this experimental approach, is going to give you the knowledge, that's when the knowledge really will make a huge difference in your mind, in your life, in your entire relationship to space and time. It's that radical. So be willing to call some of your other assumptions into question, especially those that get in the way of the quest for the end of suffering. And give this experiment a try. Rebirth is relevant. March 9, 2012. The sutta we chanted just now, the Dhammanayama Sutta, is usually chanted on occasions related to a death. It's interesting that the really serious suttas like this one, and the passages from the Abhidhamma, dependent, co-arising, the fire sermon, the not-self discourse are chanted on occasions related to death. When you have a housewarming or other event that's supposed to be auspicious, there are a lot of chants about happiness and blessings. But then when death comes, you have to get serious. Of course, if you get serious only when a death happens, it's usually too late. So it's good to be prepared, good to think about death, even if you think it's a long way away. The Buddha has you react every day that you're subject to aging, illness, and death. These things are normal not just for you, but for everybody. On some days, you have more reason to react. We had 2 funeral chants this afternoon, one we had known was going to happen, another one that came up out of nowhere. On the way back from the trip outside, we went past an accident, and the car was badly mangled. I'd be surprised if the driver survived. So we dedicated a chant to him. And what? They say that 250,000 people die every day. So there's plenty of occasion to think about death. Yet we tend to avoid it because most people have no idea of how to prepare. Death, for them, is just one of those big mysteries, and what can you do? You die. You just die. That's the way a lot of people think about it. But the Buddha went out of his way to talk about death and rebirth, because there's a skill to dying well, a skill that can save you from a lot of suffering, both while you're dying and after. Because death is not the end. Rebirth happens. Some people think that the Buddha picked up the teaching on rebirth from his culture and hadn't really thought it through. They wonder how it could be relevant to the 4 Noble Truths and the end of suffering, so they put it aside as something they can safely ignore. But it's actually extremely relevant. For one thing, rebirth wasn't universally accepted in the Buddha's time. It was a hot issue. Some people thought that there was rebirth, other people thought that there wasn't. And the way the question was approached centered on the issue of what a person is, such that a person could or couldn't be reborn. If you identified a person with something that could be annihilated, then rebirth was impossible. And even among the people who believed in rebirth, some said that there was no connection at all between rebirth and your karma. That rebirth had nothing to do with your actions, and instead just happened to follow a fate that was determined by something or somebody else. But the Buddha's take was very different. For one thing, he never talked about what it was that took rebirth. For him, rebirth was an action, a process. It was something you did, so he focused on how we do it. Most of us do it very unskillfully, and as a result, we suffer again and again. But he showed that if you focus not on what gets reborn, something for which you're not responsible, but on how it happens, something for which you are responsible, you can learn to handle the process in a way that can either alleviate a lot of the suffering or put an end to it altogether. In this way, the issues of rebirth are very relevant to the 4 Noble Truths. As he said, birth, rebirth, is one of the prime instances of suffering. And because he taught the end of suffering, An important part of his teaching had to deal with how to put an end to rebirth. Now, because rebirth is an action, it's something that at the very least you should learn to do skillfully. How do you develop the skill? Fortunately, it's the same skill we're developing right now as we're meditating. Rebirth is done through craving and clinging. The Buddha's image is of a tree that spreads from one house to another. What's the bridge between the houses that allows the tree to spread? The wind. The tree doesn't have to cling to an intermediate house to spread from house to house. It can cling to the wind, which sustains it and allows it to go to the next house. In the same way, consciousness doesn't need a body to survive. It can be sustained by clinging, and clinging is sustained by craving as it goes to the next life. Of course, craving doesn't appear in the mind only at the moment of death. Craving is appearing all the time. It's causing us to suffer to a greater or lesser extent all the time. So fortunately, it's something we can deal with right here, right now, trying to direct our cravings and desires in a skillful direction. This is why the Buddha has us employ desire to get the mind to settle down. That's a skillful desire. The desire to abandon unskillful mind states is a skillful desire. The desire to end the awakening is a skillful desire. The Buddha encourages these things because the desire for awakening is the only thing that's going to pull us out of unskillful desires and ultimately lead to genuine awakening, where desire actually ends. Remember Ven Ananda's image of the desire that takes you to a park. You hear that there's a park and you want to go see it. You walk there, based on that desire. When you get to the park, the desire is gone because you've arrived. You don't need the desire anymore. It's the same way with the path to the end of suffering. Even though the path aims at putting an end to desire, it has to use desire to get to the goal. Desire, skillful desire, is part of right art. Once you're there, the desire is no longer needed. You can put it aside. So as we meditate, we learn how to deal with our desires, our cravings, and our clingings in a skillful way. In that way, we gain the experience that will enable us to deal with rebirth in a skillful manner. Knowing which desires are skillful and which ones are not, and knowing how to let go of the unskillful ones no matter how attractive they may be. Ajahn Suwat used to speak very frequently about how your likes are what cause suffering. Yet for most of us, that's how we deny ourselves. By our likes. That's exactly how the Buddha says we deny ourselves. By our attachments, our clingings, and our cravings. This happens not only psychologically right now, but also in the way we deny the new identity we assume after death, at rebirth. So because this act of self-denition is an action and that's how the Buddha primarily looked at it, as an action you want to learn how to do it skillfully. You can learn how to master it as you go through the day. If any unskillful clingings and cravings come up, you've got to learn how to let them go while you're healthy, while you're alert, while things are going well in the body. Because it's not going to be easy when things start misbehaving in the body. The liver stops functioning, or maybe your heart stops functioning, or something else goes on strike. Every part of the body is capable of malfunctioning. There's going to be pain, there's going to be a huge sense of frustration when you can no longer tell the body to do the things you used to do. If your mind isn't under control, your cravings and clingings will just go wild. So you've got to learn how to gain some control over them. This is another reason why the Buddha taught rebirth as one of our motivations for practicing and for being really strict with ourselves as we practice. After all, some cravings and clingings in the mind appear at first glance to be no problem at all. They don't seem to be affecting anybody else. We're okay with them. But if you think about the fact that these cravings are creating not only your identity now, but also the world into which you're going to be reborn, you realize that they're dangerous. It's like tuning your radio. It'll connect with whatever's on that particular frequency. Hard rock or Beethoven or the ravings of some lunatic. Are your cravings on the frequency of the kind of world you'd really want to create and inhabit long-term? Sensual passion is the worst offender, because all of the worlds of intense suffering and conflict are on the frequency of sensual passion. Are those worlds you'd want to inhabit long-term? After all Our actions do have long-term consequences. This is another reason why the Buddha taught the fact of rebirth, because you've got to take these possibilities into consideration when you choose to act. Each time we act, it's a gamble, a wager. We have choices as to what to do. Some of them are easy and pleasant, and others are more difficult. The question is, are the more difficult ones worth it? What are their long-term consequences? And how long is long-term? How far out does that go? For a lot of people, the attitude is, as long as I can get to death, okay, that's it. That's all I care about. What happens after that will just take care of itself. Actually, death doesn't just take care of itself. We're designing what will happen after death right now. This is part of the calculation you have to take into consideration with every act. How do the calculations of what's worth it and what's not change when you factor in the possibility that the action will continue bearing fruit after you die? Admittedly, it's a wager. Until you've gained your RST taste of awakening, there's going to be an uncertainty about whether rebirth really happens and really is shaped by your actions. But the Buddha, from his own experience of awakening, admitted that it's a wise wager to take. To assume that both rebirth and the karmic role in shaping rebirth are genuine facts. Because, as he noted, you can't see all the results of actions here in this lifetime. Some people say, everything I've seen in life is enough to convince me that karma works. Well, no, it's not. There are plenty of people who do all kinds of horrible, unskillful things, yet they're still alive. They thrive. The Buddha has a long list of people who thrive because they kill, steal, engage in illicit sex, lie, or take intoxicants. They do it with the right people, and they do it in the right way to please someone in power, so they actually get rewarded by society in one way or another. But as the Buddha commented, those are only the short-term consequences. You've got to take the long-term consequences into consideration as well. You hear about people who take classes where they say, suppose you had only 1 year left to live, how would you live that now year? It would be good to have a class that says, suppose you really did get reborn and were reborn in line with your actions. How would you live your life differently given that assumption? That would be good practice, because as the Buddha said, all the awakened ones of the past and present confirm that, yes, rebirth is a fact. This has nothing to do with the culture of India or the culture of America or Europe or whatever the country. For those of us who aren't yet even partly awakened, it's a question mark. But you can't just say, I don't know and leave it at that, thinking that admitting your ignorance is enough to let you off the hook. It's like going to a financial advisor and asking, where should I invest my money? What's going to happen with the market? If the financial advisor says, I don't know, nobody knows, you go and another financial advisor. Of course, nobody in the financial world really knows the future, but they have ways of interpreting how things are likely to go. You want to ND someone who's got a good track record. Because whatever you do with your money, it's a wager. If you decide not to invest it, that's a wager, too. That you'll be better off burying it in the ground. The same with your actions. You can't just say, well, I don't know whether there's rebirth or not, so I'll just ignore the issue, because your every decision to act or not to act is a wager, and it has to take into its calculations an assumption of whether rebirth is a fact or not. Your potential for future pleasure or pain is not a matter of indifference. It may be to other people, the people who want to leave you with nothing more than a don't know attitude, but it shouldn't be to you. When you reach stream entry, that's when you'll know for sure that the Buddha is right. There is a deathless, and the activities that have kept you from reaching that deathless have been going on for a long time, not just this one lifetime. These are some of the reasons why the Buddha saw that it was very relevant to the practice that we take rebirth into our calculations every time we act, and that we make it inform our motivation, so that we practice sincerely and with real determination. Be very precise about what's going on in the mind, because every instance of thinking is an action. It's something the mind does, and tends to do very unskillfully, which is why it's tied up in sewering. If we follow the path, at the very least we can learn how to think skillfully, which makes it easier to know how to take rebirth skillfully. If we're really skillful, we won't have to take rebirth anymore. So rebirth is not just some idea that was tacked willy-nilly onto the Dhamma because the Buddha wasn't thinking properly. There were so many hot philosophical and religious issues in India at the time, and as we know from other issues, the Buddha was very particular about which issues he would address and which ones he wouldn't. Many of the issues he didn't take a stand on at all. But rebirth was something he chose to take a stand on, in his own way. After all, he was teaching a path of action to reach the end of suffering. All of his teachings are guides to action. What do we do so that we don't have to suffer? Even some of his more abstract teachings, like not self, are teachings about action. Serenity is something you do. You create a sense of self. In what ways is it skillful and in what ways is it not? When is it useful to have a sense of self? And when is it useful to put it away, put it aside? So if you're teaching a doctrine of action, you have to address the question of how to calculate the results of action, and that means you have to take a stand on rebirth. Is it something to take into consideration when you choose to act, or is it not? Is it a skill you have to work at developing beforehand or not? The Buddha says it is. The great Ajahns say it is. So the question becomes, how can we train the mind so that we don't have to suffer from rebirth? So at the very least we can handle the action of rebirth skillfully. Or even better, really skillfully, so that there's no more birth and no more suffering. The canon records the realizations that go through the mind of an arahant at the moment of release. The RST thing that you realize, after realizing the fact of release, is the fact that this is the end of birth. There's no more birth. That's the very RST thing. So it's very relevant to our practice to take this issue into consideration. As the Buddha said, the odds of coming back with a good rebirth are pretty slim. But if we really master the skills of meditation, we won't have to worry about those odds. We'll have reached the point where we don't have to wager. Always keep that in mind. Conspiracies in the mind. September 11, 2012. The world is enthralled with conspiracy theories, political conspiracies, religious conspiracies. I've even read books commenting on the Buddha's teachings, saying that he couldn't possibly have meant what he said, this business about going beyond desire. Sometimes they point out the paradox. If you want to put an end to desire, there you are, you're caught with desire, which they think places you in a double bind. So maybe there was something else that the Buddha was trying to tell you. Maybe the Dhamma's a conspiracy. That's what they think. There's a big irony here. The Buddha's teachings are the most straightforward, compassionate teachings in the world, and yet people still try to get around them. The problem is, of course, that there is a conspiracy going on in their own minds. They don't want to practice. If greed, aversion, and delusion can dress themselves up as wisdom, as Dhamma, they can fool you very easily. So you have to be very careful. As for conspiracy theories outside, there probably are some conspiracies going on. As someone once said, just the fact that you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't really conspiring against you. But even if there are conspiracies going on outside, what are you going to do about them? The real conspiracy is the way the mind fools itself into wanting things that are going to disappoint it in the end, and we play along. We've been disappointed many, many times in the past, but we keep going back to the same old thoughts of greed, same old thoughts of aversion, same old thoughts of delusion, as if somehow, if we rearrange the elements a little bit, they'd turn out a lot better this time. But it's really the same old stew, just over and over again. So instead of suspecting that the Buddha's conspiring against you or the Pali Canon, or the people who compass the canon or the Thai Ajahns, or whoever try to see to what extent you're not being honest with yourself, that's where the real test for the teaching comes in. Ajahn Lee and Ajahn Vuang make the point again and again and again, that if you want to nd the truth, you really have to be true to yourself. Your own honesty is your only guarantee. After all, we've encountered plenty of cases in the past where texts were highly regarded, even worshipped, And yet they turned out to be false, sometimes very detrimental. So who knows who compassed the Pali Canon or what their motivation was? The real question, though, is, how are you going to test it? You test it in your own practice. Fortunately, the qualities that the texts recommend that you develop in order to test the Dhamma are going to stand you in good stead no matter what. Wherever you go in life, you're going to need more mindfulness, more alertness, more discernment, more integrity. So the fact that you're asked to develop these qualities is not a waste, even if it turned out that there never really was a Buddha, just a bunch of monks sitting around thinking things up for the fun of it. Someone once said, whether there really was a Buddha or not, whoever wrote the canon was pretty inspired, but still, their being inspired is no guarantee that their inspiration was true. Your guarantee, however, is your own truthfulness. There's the image the Buddha gives of the elephant hunter who goes into the forest and sees footprints that resemble the footprints of a bull elephant. But the elephant hunter is a wise and experienced hunter who doesn't jump to conclusions. He knows that not every large footprint comes from a bull elephant. There are dwarf females with big feet. Of course, there's nothing wrong with female elephants, but dwarf females can't do the work that a bull elephant can do. You want a bull elephant. So even though the large footprints are no guarantee, they look likely, so you follow them. As you follow them, you see scratch marks high up in the trees, on the bark, on the limbs. Again, the experienced elephant hunter doesn't come to the conclusion that those must be the marks of a bull elephant because, after all, there are tall, skinny females with tusks. The scratch marks may be theirs. It's only when you keep following the footprints and now see a bull elephant in a clearing that you really know. This is the bull elephant for sure. It's the same with the practice. When you practice concentration to the point where the mind really does settle down in jhana, those levels of concentration are just footprints. Psychic powers are scratch marks. The only real guarantee is the experience of the deathless. And even with that, you have to be very, very honest and have a lot of integrity not to overestimate yourself. You have to work on your integrity. That's what helps you see the tricks of your own dilemmas. It helps you see through any overestimation that may develop around your attainments. There's so much written about people who have low self-esteem as they meditate, and every effort is made to give them high self-esteem. But the opposite is also true. Overly high self-esteem is a huge obstacle. And again, it's one of the conspiracies in your mind. So whenever you ND yourself thinking about outside conspiracies, remember. The big conspiracy is the way the mind fools itself. That's the conspiracy that you're really sewering from. The world outside is never going to be free of conspiracies or conspiracy theories. As we all know, this is the way human beings act. They know that some things are rightly regarded as wrong, but that doesn't keep them from doing those things. They just try to do them in secret. That sort of human behavior is never going to stop. But you can stop your own inner conspiracies. This is why it's useful to think about the dilemmas of the mind as something separate from you, because if you can't see them as separate, you'll never be able to gain insight into them. The image of the committee in the mind is very useful here. This inner committee is not a group of angels deciding to put on a charity event. They're the city council in a really corrupt city. There are a lot of shady dealings going on behind the scenes. So when ideas come up in the mind, you have to learn how to step back from them. Question them. Think of the example of Ajahn Mun or Upasaka key people who didn't have a teacher to guide them in the meditation. In every case, they had to be very, very wary of what their minds were telling them. In Ajahn Mun's case, he was getting a lot of visions, and he had to learn how to treat them in a way that they wouldn't make him go astray. If he had a vision of a diva, he had to learn how to regard the vision as not really a diva coming to talk to him. He had to ask the question, what if this is my mind playing tricks on me? How do I protect against that? As he came to realize, the RST step is that you try to determine, what's the Dhamma lesson here? Then you try to determine how you might actually test the message in practice. Only if it passed the test could you trust it regardless of whether the vision really did come from a diva. Then there's Upasika Key's advice that when a realization comes into the mind, be very careful to see what happens in the next mental moment after that. What does your mind say? How does it comment on this? What assumptions is it making? Can you learn how to catch them and drop them? This is how you learn how to see through some of those conspiracies. And that helps keep your practice on the right path. Contentment. June 10, 2013. The principle of contentment with whatever you have is so important that the Buddha mentioned it 3 times when he described the 4 customs of the noble ones. 3 of the customs are contentment with whatever food you have, contentment with whatever clothing you have, and contentment with whatever shelter you have. It's important to keep this in mind. Ajahn Suwat said this was one of Ajahn Mun's favorite Dhamma topics, the customs of the noble ones, partly in response to people who kept accusing him of not following Thai and Laotian customs. Going out living in the forest and eating only 1 meal a day, not going to bless houses. These were not the sorts of things that monks were ordinarily doing in that time. It's easy enough when we look at the customs of other cultures and see that they're strange. We have to remember that the customs of the noble ones go against our own culture as well. And contentment is one of the big things that really separates the customs of the noble ones from American and Western culture in general right now. Everyone is being trained not to be content, to want things just like this or just like that, faster, faster, faster. To keep the economy going, to keep up appearances. So it's important to remember that the practice of the Dhamma really breaks with that idea. You learn to be content with what you've got. Try to keep things simple because the simpler your surroundings, the easier it is to practice. When you're not getting happiness from your surroundings, when things outside are not pleasing, they help to force the issue. There's no pleasure out there? Well, look inside for your happiness. This is where the 4th custom comes in. That you take delight in developing and delight in abandoning, i.e., developing skillful qualities and abandoning unskillful ones. The delight reminds us that we're not being stoic just to be stoic. We want to enjoy looking for happiness inside, and to enjoy being independent from things outside. This applies not only to things, but also to relationships. We're constantly looking for a good relationship with this or that person. We're moving our focus in the direction where it shouldn't be going, it should be coming back in, because relationships, like things, end. And just as with things, our culture has a lot of pressure to go for relationships. We're not doing our duty as members of our culture if we're not looking for a relationship, and we don't look good in the eyes of other people. If we can enjoy not having to look good in their eyes or to meet with their approval, then we're that much closer to freedom. If you're really serious about practicing the Dhamma, you've got to say, whatever you can do to simplify your life, you do that. Whatever you can do to simplify your surroundings, you do that. And when things outside are not happy, not quite what you want them to be, you turn around and look for your pleasure in developing skillful qualities and abandoning unskillful ones. Ajahn Mahabua talks about the satisfaction that comes from seeing a dilemma, even if it's just a little dilemma falling like just a little piece of bark falling a tree. You've got to learn how to take satisfaction in that kind of accomplishment. That's where we look for our pleasure. Notice, the Buddha doesn't say, be content with what skillful qualities you have or be content with what unskillful qualities you have. In fact, he said that he reached awakening precisely because he didn't let himself rest content with whatever skillful qualities he had developed until he reached the point where there was nothing more to develop. So he's not teaching radical acceptance. He's teaching us to learn how to focus our attention where it really matters, where it really will make a difference. When you think about relationships, think about the comment he made one time that it's hard to meet anyone who has never been your mother or your father or your brother or your sister or your son or your daughter. Our relationships have been shooing around so much that we've lost track of how many cards there are and how many different hands we've played. He added that just that thought should be enough to make you want to go for release instead. Ajahn Fuang made a similar comment. If there's a pleasure you really hanker after, it's a sign that you had it in a previous lifetime. and you miss it. That too, he said, should make you want to go for release, because you realize that if you get the pleasure again, you're going to lose it again. You're going to miss it again. You're going to hanker for it again, and it's never ending. There is no satisfaction in things, there is no satisfaction in relationships. Even really good relationships end. And when they end, they can be devastating. That's why we turn and look inside. This is where we place all our efforts to change things. Change your mind. Change your attitudes. Develop the skills inside that make it satisfying to change your mind, to change your attitudes. That's where we should focus our attention. That's the culture of the noble ones. Just as Ajahn Mun faced a lot of pressure to make his practice more like standard Thai Laotian practice, we get a lot of pressure to make the Dhamma more American. What it seems to come down to is simply that it'll sell better, but we're not here to sell the Dhamma. We're here to practice the Dhamma. Ajahn Zuit once said, we're not here to get other people, we're here to get ourselves. And if other people see what we're doing, like what we're doing, and they want to join in, that's nah. But the primary point has to be that we're practicing. We're taking delight in developing skillful qualities and taking delight in abandoning unskillful ones. That's where you want to learn to be a connoisseur, to have high standards as to what you will and won't accept. As for things outside, learn to be grateful for whatever you do get. Look around yourself here at the monastery. Everything here comes from someone's generosity. Nobody was forced to give anything. Nobody was giving anything out of a sense of obligation. They gave out of the goodness of their hearts. So we should learn to be grateful for everything that comes our way, and learn how to express that gratitude by delighting in developing skillful qualities and delighting in abandoning unskillful ones. Take this principle of contentment to heart. It's not just words, it's the way we live. And if it's not the way we're living, it's the way we should be living. As the Buddha once said, it's one of the principles that determines when a particular practice or a particular attitude in the mind is or is not in line with the Dhamma. Does it lead to contentment, or does it lead to discontent? The Buddha himself said that discontent with regard to skillful qualities is an important principle. In fact, it was one of the principles that led to his own awakening. But as for contentment with material things, that's something you've really got to develop, for only then will your practice be in line with the Dhamma. So be clear as to where your contentment should be focused, and where your discontent should be focused. If you see that you're still engaging in unskillful thoughts or you're still causing stress in one way or another to your own mind, that's an area where you should not be content. You want to gure out what you're doing wrong and how you can change the situation. As for material things, we've got more than enough here. Every time you use anything, remember you're using someone else's generosity, so you want to use it frugally and well. Use it with a sense of appreciation for its purpose in training your mind, because that's why they gave it. So that it would be used in the practice of training the mind. Even when you're outside of the monastery, where basically, business as usual is business as usual, and not everything that comes your way is an act of generosity, be sensitive to when it is. Have a sense of appreciation. And constantly be on the lookout for ways in which you can be countercultural. In other words, you can embody the culture of the noble ones, even as you're living in a very antagonistic culture, one that's trying to pull you away in all sorts of other directions, making you discontented with material things. And contented with whatever's arising in your mind. In some ways, this makes you an outsider, but outsiders are in a good position. They're not automatically sucked into all the craziness that you can ND in every society. There's a strength that comes with being an outsider. If your situation has to be a particular way, it has to be like this, has to be like that, you're a hothouse creature. The temperature has to be just right, the humidity has to be just right. The fertilizer, the sunlight, everything has to be very carefully controlled, or otherwise you'll die. That's not a strong plant. The strong plants are the ones that can live in any situation. As a practitioner, you want to try to make yourself strong in just that same way, willing and able to thrive in any situation. If you're responsible for having a nuance on the situation, do what you can to keep it simple, so that you can maintain your focus. Here at Wat Metta, we're part of the forest tradition, but physically we're widely separated from where most of the tradition is being practiced in Thailand. It's by trying to maintain the culture of the noble ones that we maintain a sense of closeness to the rest of the tradition. The same holds true when you leave the monastery. Try to maintain these attitudes of contentment with food, clothing, shelter, and your delight not in having nice food, clothing, or shelter, but in noticing when you can develop skillful qualities in the mind, and when you can abandon unskillful ones. That's how you stay close. In harmony with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the immense importance of sharing wisdom expansively. Presently, we've transformed this extensive 1,000-page work into a readily accessible audio format. The duty to advance this noble cause now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, benefiting numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of knowledge sharing and the cultivation of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We extend an invitation for you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can bring profound positive change to the lives of many.